to a lot of people, I feel like it's gonna sound like you're a superwoman. You've done all the things. It almost sounds like this straight line from being a kid who loved to write and draw to, going to school, learning how to illustrate, getting a job in publishing, becoming a children's book creator, and then transitioning into graphic novels. Like, woo! So I want you to tell me now, was it a straight line like that?
Great question. No, 100% not a straight line. It just never is. No, I didn't write and draw for a long period of time. I first went to college to be an architect because I was creative and I love math. And my father said, you really should do something that ends up with a job, not
Mm,
I grew up in a rural area and there just really weren't a lot of role models for what direction you take art and drawing other
yeah.
than maybe an architect. So I went to school for architecture. I didn't fall in love with that. So then I went into psychology for a while at school. But all the while, I kept having this nagging feeling of wanting to draw. So I was at one university for psychology and then snuck over to another university and said, can I just audit some illustration
Mm,
classes over here? And I was driving an hour away to audit illustration
mhm.
classes in the background. Um, so it was not a straight line at all. And my first job straight out of college did happen to be in publishing. It was in New York, but it was at a magazine and it was on the business side because I had so much statistics and math background coming
Mm,
straight out of college. So they hired me to work in their circulation department at the Atlantic Monthly. So I was doing the little cards that fall out of your magazine and drive everyone crazy. That was my first job out of college. And I could see on the other side of my cubicle the art department, and they had the color printers, they had all of the, just amazing. They were just doing creative stuff all day, and I knew that's where I wanted to be. And so at that time, it was all about Quark, and I learned Quark, and I got a job in an art department at a magazine. So it's related, it's creative. It was wonderful to be a designer, but it
mm.
also wasn't my complete passion. I knew somewhere in the background there was still this sense of wanting to tell stories and be an illustrator. And so from there, I did go to. I was in New York already. I was working at that job, and I went to the MFA program at SVA while I was working as a graphic designer. And that was an incredible experience. I was young. I mean, I'm much older now. It's been a
Mhm.
long line. When you ask if it was a straight line, that should probably have been the first thing I said. It's been a very long line. So there have been a lot of years to do a lot of things. Um, but the program was incredible. My advisor was Peter Cease. He was
That's the
unbelievable.
person who got me into publishing.
Oh, that's amazing! Really? At
Yeah.
Was he at Scholastic at that point?
Oh, it's a funny story. I'll tell it to you another time. It's
Okay. That's funny. He's such a wonderful, generous person. He had, I would go to his studio weekly to visit with him. He introduced me to editors. But again, I was really young and I didn't have a voice or a sense of the stories that I wanted to tell. And there just wasn't a there yet. I
Mhm,
hadn't figured out who I wanted to be illustration wise or
mhm.
storytelling wise. So I continued on as a designer for many years, and I moved to San Francisco where I live now. And there wasn't magazine publishing here, which did make me sad because I loved magazines were really fun at that point. It was
Mhm.
kind of a thriving industry, and even though I wasn't illustrating, they would let me illustrate a little on the side sometimes. They'd be
Mhm.
like, "We're going to hire you to do spots here and there," so it felt related. And here I ended up doing a lot more marketing, which didn't feel it wasn't as much of a passion for me. So when I had my first daughter, we crunched the numbers. We were like, does it make sense for me to go back to work and, hire a babysitter at X
Mhm.
millions of dollars a year? Not really. So I stayed home. And at that point I decided, okay, now I'm going to make it happen. And I started going to SCBWI conferences and started um, just illustrating quite a bit. And it was a number of years even after that before my first book was published. I think that was about 2007. I started really thinking about writing and illustrating. It took 3 or 4 years, and then my first book came out in 2011. And
Okay.
then since 2011, I've done maybe, I think it's about 18 picture books.
Wow, almost a book a year, more or less?
Yeah, 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 a little bit more, I guess, than a book a
Mhm,
year, starting in 2011, and
mhm.
then the graphic novels count for 40 books. I don't know what is I don't know what the equivalent in terms of work is between a picture book and a graphic novel, but it's exponentially different in terms of work.
Well,
So
you're sort of transitioning into my next question, which was about the transition from picture books to graphic novels. Um, I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but just get us started with what are some baseline differences between being a writer and illustrator of picture books versus graphic novels?
um, there are a few. So maybe I'll just mention quickly sort of why the transition happened for me, just as a little bit of
Mhm,
background. It might be helpful. Somewhere around 2016, I started thinking about graphic novels for a few reasons. And the first was, and primarily, that I just really wanted to write stories with with more character development, more involved characters. I'd be working on picture books and find myself doing silly dialogues or asides or moments that I felt like I would love to include in a book, but with picture books, everything has to lead to plot with only
mhm,
32 pages. If you try to put in asides, I think they're distracting.
mhm.
They just don't work. Picture books work so well as short stories. I think most
Yeah.
of them work in that vein, or concept books. I've done a lot of concept books.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, so I just really was wanting to develop characters. And at the same time, my kids were getting older. And so I wasn't so steeped in picture books. I was reading different kinds of books and starting to discover graphic novels a little bit through them, and
mhm.
absolutely fell in love with Phoebe and her Unicorn. For sure, that was the first book I read that I just said, these characters have my heart and I would love to do, you know,
Mhm.
aspire to something like that someday. So those two things were happening. And then just sort of in the background, I was also running the school book fair and watching, I did that from 2014 to about 2018, watching the sales at those book fairs. And it was an education. It was incredible. The graphic novels were selling, so just outselling everything else in such an incredible way. I think the final year I did it, I asked the bookseller, we worked with this wonderful independent bookseller. They brought in an incredible range of books. We had everything, and yet it was always the graphic novels that sold. And so the last year I said, could you give me a breakdown of how things sold? I'm just super curious. Like, is it, as are the graphic novels selling as well as I think? And they were over 50% of the total sales for
Wow.
grades K through 8. So, and that's out of all genres. That's outselling the Ninjago books and all of the nonfiction, the
Mhm,
Minecraft books at that time.
mhm,
It was
mhm,
very impressive. So that was in the back of my mind too. Um, so those are the reasons that I started to make the transition. And for me, the main things that I found to be different and that I really had to work on uh, were storytelling. Number one,
mm,
storytelling.
mhm,
Um, because picture books are short stories and mine were concept books, to
mhm,
just really dig into longer form storytelling took a lot of work. And I read the books, I read Save the Cat, I
mhm,
read everything out there. And what ultimately I think I try to do is, I guess, how as an illustrator, you will sometimes draw an image and then you flip it to make sure it's working in both directions. That's a thing
mhm,
that a lot of illustrators do. I think with story, for me, what has worked is to try to view it through a lot of different prisms. So I'll
mhm,
kind of run it through the Save the Cat filter and go, okay, it's sort of working from that direction.
mhm.
And then if I get stuck, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to now run it through the Pixar story spine and see, is it working that way too? And then just keep kind of looking at it from different angles and asking all of the questions that those different sort of structures ask. Because I don't really think that there's one that's perfect or that you have to follow, and obviously there are rules that can be broken. But to
Mhm,
just generally make sure, okay, is it basically looking right from most directions? That
mhm,
was a big change for me, and for a long time I poo-pooed a lot of screenwriting stuff, like, it's so formulaic. I don't want to do any of it. But I think you sort of have to at least digest it and
yeah.
have an awareness of it. So for me, the storytelling was big. And then obviously the drawing skills are huge. You're drawing so much. In a picture book, you can get by without having great drawing skills. And I think it's absolutely impossible with a graphic novel to do that, just because however many hundreds of drawings you're doing and over again, and consistency, and all of that stuff. So those two are big differences for me. And then the main difference in terms of working with publishers for me was schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I worked with them. In my experience, picture books were almost always late. The schedules were almost always off. They just flip. You'd lose a month here, you'd lose a month there. Your publisher, your editor would be late in getting back to you with comments. And while it was sort of frustrating sometimes, it usually didn't knock us off schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be accommodated without a lot of stress, because I usually had 3 to 4 months to do final art for a picture book. And that's pretty doable for
Mm-hmm.
30 images.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're talking about the amount of work and the number of phases that you have with a graphic novel, getting off schedule, it just balloons and it can be catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
So it changed the way that I talk to my editors about schedule. Whereas with picture books, I was a little loose and like, okay, sure, whatever. With
Mm-hmm.
this, I started actually with a resource that I found on KCU, which somebody had mentioned, which was the scheduling document that Carrie Peach did. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's how her last name is
Mm-hmm.
pronounced,
Mm-hmm.
which is like my Bible for every
Mm-hmm.
project. I sit down with that and I map out how long each phase is going to take. And in order to do that really well, you have to have a good sense of how long it takes you to pencil a page, how long it takes you to ink a page, how long it takes you to color a page. So one of my biggest pieces of advice is just to sort of start clocking that at whatever point you're making pages.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, as you're working on any comics, just get a really good sense of how long that takes, because that's the building block for the whole schedule. You have to be able to build a schedule that works.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, it was really easy for me to look at that and say to my editor, no, I can't hit that deadline. That's totally impossible. Or to
Mm-hmm.
say, you know, if you want to hit whatever publishing date, you'd need to turn your comments around to me in 3 weeks at each period, or within a month or whatever, so that we could actually work together from that. Because they're as much in the dark as we are, a little bit, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of really what it takes to put a graphic novel together. So having a document like that to just work from and
Mm-hmm.
keep it all on schedule is really helpful for me. And then also, if she would be late, if an editor would be late in getting back to you, you could say to them, hey, we're in danger here, and
Mm-hmm.
not hesitate to do that. Whereas in the picture book, I might have let it slide.
Mm-hmm.
So the schedule piece was really, really huge for me as a difference. And for me, I hate missing deadlines. I'm really kind of like compulsive that way, which is probably a personality trait that helped with this. But I think for anyone, it's not a project you can do. You can't be lax. You can't
Yeah.
just be like, it's going to get done when it gets done, because I don't think they
Oh.
ever would. So
For sure.
yeah. So
Wow.
that's a lot of talking, but the schedule is huge, and then storytelling and just drawing, just a lot of drawing are the main differences for me.
Yeah. Okay. I think I might work backwards from there a little bit because I will have a few follow-up questions on those points. So starting with the schedule, one conundrum I would think would be that when you're first starting a graphic novel for the very first time, and you're trying to calculate how long does it take me for the thumbnails and for the pencils and the inks and everything, I feel like it would be challenging in the beginning because everything takes longer when you're first figuring things out. And maybe actually that's kind of apropos because our theme for the month of August is finding your style. And I think um, when you just getting started with a graphic novel project, I'm guessing you probably have to do a lot of experiments to sort of see what style what style works for the story, but is also fast enough for you to be able to complete the work. So can you say anything about that, about what you did in the beginning to hone in on exactly what the style for this book was going to be and whether you got faster as you went along?
Okay. Yes, I did get faster, I think. Interestingly, not tremendously much faster. It's been, that was sort of a surprise to me that once I'd done probably 10 or 20 pages, I had a pretty good estimate as to how long it was going to take me to do the rest of the book. But
Mhm.
there is a lot of style experimentation. And we actually, and this is not necessarily typical, but we had a big chunk of time where my editor was unavailable. It was about a year. And so
Mhm.
I had that year where nothing was happening on the book, which was sort of driving me crazy. But
Mhm.
in retrospect, probably good because it gave me a lot of time to mess around with style before we really dug into the churning of, okay, now we have to be doing
Mhm.
pages every day. Um, and for me, I was pretty certain that I was going to want to do a style that was watercolor-ish
Mhm.
because I love watercolor. I've worked in watercolor for a lot of my books. It makes me happy. There's a little sense of motion and movement with it. And a lot of the experimentation for me was in how can I get something that feels like that digitally, because I knew that I wasn't going to be actually doing watercolor pages. So yes, there was a lot of time in what's the right brush, what is the
Mhm.
right feel, looking at tons and tons of books to see has anybody done something like that in a way that feels good to me. And I also knew I was going to do line because I do like line
Mhm.
work. I might have mentioned this before, but I've worked in calligraphy, so the sense of working with nibs and
Mhm.
pens is just really comfortable to me and really something that I enjoy. So for me, that was sort of set. And
Mhm.
I do encourage people to, pay attention to what makes them feel good, the
Mhm.
sorts of materials and medium that they love versus necessarily trying to emulate what someone
Mhm.
else is doing, because it's a long process. So you want to be doing something that really sort of, makes your heart sing while you're doing
Mhm.
it. You don't want to be, and you want it to feel like yours. So that was the piece for me. What line feels like mine? What watercolor style can I come up with? And there was experimentation there, but at least those two things were in my mind as a starting point. I
Mhm.
think maybe because I'd done so many picture books and just because of the work I've done in the past.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
what was the final page count for Wagnificent?
160.
Okay. And can you tell us how long did it take from, well, maybe you could start by like when was the moment when you first had the idea to the publication date, and then kind of narrow in on particular periods how long different phases took.
Hmm. Yeah, sure. I think I first had the idea around 2018, somewhere in there,
Mhm.
2019. And I won't get into it too much, but it is based on one of my dogs, and she was the inspiration for it. And I'd just been thinking for some time, oh, I would like to do a story about a dog and a
Mhm.
girl and really highlight that bond and bring that
Mhm.
to the forefront. Um, but I couldn't quite find my way into. That's all I had. I was like, well, I don't really have any conflict. I don't really know what the story is. I just know that there's
Mhm.
something there. So I was playing around with that as an idea, and then just coincidentally, I happened to be at a book festival where they had a petting zoo, and I was waiting for my turn to present. So of course, I went to the petting zoo and petting
Mhm.
sheep and petting whatever. And they had a domestication timeline on the wall, and it mentioned that dogs were the first domesticated animals, which I knew, like you sort of,
Mhm.
that's something most of us know in the back of our minds, but it hit me a little differently that day. I was like, all right, of course. And it just got some wheels turning in terms of research and thinking about dogs and thinking about their ancestry and their past. And at that point, I brought in a wolf character. And that's when I felt like, okay, now I have this sort of triangle. I've got some conflict. Now I have a story that I
Mhm.
can write. So I think I was working on writing that for and back and forth with my writing groups and
Mhm.
people for probably a year and a half or 2 years trying to figure that
Mhm.
out, and at the same time trying to figure out um, graphic novels just in
Mhm.
general, which is when I joined KCU kind of toward the end of that
Mhm.
period, maybe 2020.
Mhm.
um, because I just had no idea what the process was. How do you write a script? Any of it. And so
Mhm.
I joined to figure all of that out, which
Mhm.
thankfully it's been amazing and incredible
Mhm.
resource for that. So there was the initial writing period. We got a lot of rejections in the beginning. It just, the pages weren't looking great. The initial story, I was trying to do a back and forth of two narratives, one in sort of, 20,000 years ago and one now, and it just wasn't really working. So we ditched the back and forth, and that's when it started to get a little bit more traction. So that took up until, so weird, pandemic years are just like lost in my mind. Was it 2020 or 2021 that it went into contract? I think 2020 maybe. No, 2021, the very beginning of 2021, it went into contract. And then we had a slow year because my editor had a lot going on. So that was the year that I was kind of working on just things in the background and thinking about how I wanted to do it, thinking about how I was going to set up the schedule, which was, again, crazy and frustrating at the time, but really, I think, fortuitous to have had that time to just think and get all my ducks in a row before it all started going. So there was that down year when I was working on style, thinking about schedule. And then once we really started moving, the sketches took me about 4 months. The inks took me about 3.5, and the color took me about 3.5. So a little less than a year to do all the art.
And the lettering, did you do the lettering?
I did. So the lettering was a font that I made. So yes, and I did set it. I did this with Macmillan, and they like it if you know InDesign and work in InDesign already to have you set the type. So I did all of that. It helps me, having worked as a designer. It was probably the first step that I did. I'm starting to work on the third book now and just setting up the files. And it's one of the first things I do is just place all the lettering on the pages to go, oh, that's way too much text there. Oh, that'll work. Or, it's just sort of how I think anyway as a designer.
Yeah, you're not the only one. I have heard other graphic novelists. Not everybody does it this way, but there are people who will literally lay out the lettering on all the pages before they do the drawings.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and then the other thing, I also did the little logo type too, but that's hand lettered, the Wagnificent. So that was fun to do. Yeah.
Okay. You did mention something that wasn't something I was going to talk to you about, but now that you said it, I'm very excited to dig into it a little bit, which was that you got a lot of rejections. I love talking about that whole process because, it causes so much angst in so many people. And I love talking to creators like you who are established, but you still get rejections, and you have to go back to the drawing board with some aspect of what you're working on. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like you had an initial pitch that you did send out to some publishers and didn't get anywhere with that. So then you changed some aspects. Can you tell me a little more detail about that?
I think the main thing that we changed was the script. In terms of the initial script had this back and forth between present day and 10,000 years ago wolves kind of becoming dogs. And so it was a little choppy. So we removed that. Now we just have a little flashback moment of what happened 10, 20,000 years ago. But there's a full story arc that's in the present in this book. And I think that was the huge piece of it. But the other thing that I think kind of happened in the background, because that probably took another 9 months or something, or 10 months of playing around with it, is that was about the time that I joined KCU. And I think in the background, I was figuring out how to actually do pages and draw pages. So I think my sample pages improved quite a bit. I think the visual storytelling got better. Even though the skills are similar between a picture book and a graphic novel, obviously comics has its own language, and I was learning that language along the way, and obviously still learning. It's a language you could be learning forever. I think that's the fun and the frustration of it. So I think those two things got better. The script got better, and my sample pages got better, and so it was just a better package by the time it was not rejected. But yeah, I've been through so much, rejection, and I was doing sending in, back when we send in whole packages
Mhm.
with a stamped
Mhm.
self-addressed envelope to get your
Mhm.
rejection back. And I have the requisite pile of
Mhm.
however many picture book rejections that I got
Mhm.
back in the year. So I actually think that was a better thing to get something physical back that was like, thank you, but no thank you, than
Mhm.
to just send things off into the ether and not
Mhm. Yeah.
always hear back. I think it's very frustrating for people. I understand why it is, but
Yeah. There's a lot of systemic problems. I think there's just,
yes.
I don't have any solutions, although I try to think about it all the time.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that it did take you around 9 months to work on the revision of the pitch that actually did end up getting you the book deal. So many times, if I'm having a conversation with a creator about a specific project and we agree that they need to work on a few things in it, and they'll say to me, well, it might take me a couple months to get this back to you. Is that okay? And I'm like trying not to laugh because I'm like, it's totally fine. I expect that
Yeah.
it is going to take that long. And in fact, if it took twice or three times as long as you're saying, that is totally normal. It's absolutely normal. If I gave somebody feedback and they went away and they worked on it and they came back to me a year later, I wouldn't bat an eyelash.
Right. Yeah, I think sometimes you do need a little distance too as a creator. You need to get to the point where it's been in a drawer for a while and you can take it out and you can be mostly objective about it. And it's crazy to me how that happens, how you'll get feedback at one point and be like, there's nothing I could change. I couldn't possibly change anything here. Where would I even start?
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
you put it away for a month and look at it again and you're like, oh, okay, of course. Like it would,
Yes.
so it's almost like a mind trick you have to play with yourself to give it a little space and then come back to it. So yeah,
Yeah.
you learn that over time. It's hard in the beginning as a creator who really wants your work out in the world to think about, oh, it's going to be another
Hmm.
2 months, another nine
Yeah.
months, another however many months. So I
Yeah.
know that impulse to just get
Yeah.
it done, but
Well, even what you said
yeah, it makes
about the
sense.
editor being kind of out of the picture for a year and being frustrated with that, same thing has happened with some of the people that I work with, where literally something will be delayed almost a year because of one thing or another. And I would say more often than not, even though it's frustrating for everybody, something good ends up coming from it oftentimes.
Yeah,
So it is just a very slow process.
absolutely. Yeah.
So, when we were emailing back and forth about stuff to talk about, you mentioned that you made a style guide and a palette and value studies. You had some very specific things that you did in the
Mhm.
preparation of the art. So, I don't know if you have any show and tell or anything like that. I'd love to see.
Sure, I could show a few things just sort of my process and
Mhm.
how I approach things. I right now I'm working on the third book in the series. So
Mhm.
we just finished the second book. I just turned in color on that, which is great. And I had like 2 days of a break and now I'm back into sketches for the third book. But I have here my manuscript and it's messy.
Mhm.
And all of these little bits are my thumbnails. I just go ahead after I have a manuscript written, I thumbnail on it. I find that to be the easiest way to start the
Mhm.
process. I don't do a super specific manuscript. I know some people break them out by panels. I don't, which is a little bit of that feeling of flying by the seat of your pants until you do pagination and then you're like, oh, okay, it actually is going to be 160 pages or whatever it needs to be. But it's just, I think I like to have a little bit of looseness in the thumbnailing process. So I don't think that specifically in panels up front.
Mhm.
So that's where I start. I do lots of those tiny little thumbnails. And then from there, I do, grab this. I mean, what would I call them? They're like larger thumbnails in this sketchbook. And I use this because it's all these Strathmore, almost
Mhm.
exactly the same trim size as the
Mhm.
typical graphic novel. So one of the reasons I do these And these are super loose, like that's a spread, like the loosest you'll ever see. It's just for me. But one of the reasons I do that, and I do it by hand, is to see how large they actually are and how large these images are in real life. When you're working digitally, you can really lose track of that entirely. So it's just good to know, okay, this feels like the right size for this, and it's not just the right size in relation to the other things on a page. It's like the actual right size for the book itself. So yeah, I just do the whole book, put these silly, very messy sketches. And then from there, I take those and I do my sketches with Prismacolor non-photo blue, and then I draw over it with just a regular graphite pencil. And I do the whole book like that, and I keep them in binders. I've got these binders all over my office. It's ridiculous. I'm like, oh, I never thought I'd be a binder person, but I don't know how else to keep it all organized. And again, I do that process by hand, not on a computer, just to mix it up. Because I think for me at least, if I'm drawing on the computer all the time, the chance of repetitive injury is higher. Whereas this is okay. I have one face that I'm drawing on paper. I love drawing on paper anyway, so that's a major reason for doing it. But yeah, so that's how I do the sketch process. And then from there, I ink digitally and I color digitally. So all of that happens on the computer. But before I color, I print out these tiny pages and I just do little value studies with markers, with Copic markers on them. Just to have a sense of where, so I just print out the ink. So it's just an ink that's printed out, and then I draw over them with a little Copic marker. Just to have a sense. So I've I've got the 20% gray, 40% gray, and 60% gray. I can't remember, something like that, or just to have a sense of where the darks are, where the lights are, and mostly where the lighting is. I mostly do this to think about where's my light source. And then it's just done ahead of time. And then you can really just focus on the color and, look at this once in a while to be like, oh, right, the light's going to come from that direction on this image. And it takes a little bit of the brain work out of the color process. So the color's just really about color and thinking about palette. So that's that piece. But then the style guide was a big piece of this for me. And that I did early on. And one of the great things about working with Macmillan, I don't know about other publishers, but Macmillan makes you do proof pages early on. They just want to see how everything is going to work together, and it's brilliant, and it's what definitely needs to happen, because you can't get too far into this process without seeing if it works or not. Like if you are inking and then you realize like the ink line isn't what you thought it was, or it would take so much work to redo all of it. So we did proof pages early on. And one of the cool things about proof pages is that you have to sort of identify all of the different graphic elements in the book that you want to look at. So for example, let me see if I can grab this. So for example, in the book, there's a pretty standard palette that's used throughout. So we did a few of those standard palette pages. And then there are pages in the flashbacks that are totally different palette. And so we obviously proof those as well. And then there are little items like throughout, I have this little wagometer that I use. So we proofed that. And part of doing the style guide was just identifying those pieces, which is really helpful in terms of making sure we proof the right things, but then also in just having, sorry, I've got too many binders. In terms of making sure that up front, I know what everything looks like, and I just have a quick reference for it. So again, another binder, my style guide, I put my schedule in the front of it. And then I had all of these sort of things that I wanted to think about, that these are just words, things I wanted to think about as I was doing my sketches, and a lot of this comes from Rivka and her amazing classes, just about being clear in my panels, making sure the emotion is there, all of those pieces. I wrote it down because I just each time want to go back and refer to that. But then I have tons and tons and tons of sketches I've done of all my characters in my sketchbook forever. And I just gathered them all in one place. And I found it, so this is just many, many pages of sketches of the characters. And I found it in different emotions. And I found it really helpful to have all of those just
Mhm.
as a quick guide to go, okay, this is what she looks like. This is what the character looks like when she's angry, when she's
Mhm.
sad, maybe when she's jumping.
Mhm.
Um, Same thing for the wolf.
Mhm. Oh, wow.
Um, and then one of the things that I found super helpful was to, and you can see here's a palette I was working on. I changed it a million
Mhm.
and a half times, but
Mhm.
we proofed the palette with the proof pages, which turned out to be so helpful because then you know exactly what those colors are going to look like printed. And we went back and used that palette to pick things out for the end papers, or
Mhm.
it was just it's so helpful to have it throughout the process to know exactly how they're going to print on a page. So
Mhm.
I highly recommend that as a little hack or whatever you want to call it. When you do your proof pages, proof your palette, have your little swatches so you can look at those, because things do shift from a computer screen, even if it's super well calibrated, and that's
Mhm.
helpful to know. I have my other character little drawings of my other characters in here, and then also of the environments, which I
Mhm.
kept loose. Like they're very loose, but these are the
Mhm.
buildings that are in the
Mhm.
town, just what order they're in, the
Mhm.
things that you
Mhm.
think you're going to remember really
Mhm.
easily, but then you don't. Like, was the bookstore
Mhm.
next to the hardware store? Or so yeah, you have a little map of where everything is. So to have all of those in one place was very helpful for me as I was going through illustrations. Because yeah, you do forget stuff. Like you think it's all in your head, the minute you're drawing, you're like, of course I'm going to remember exactly how this
Uh-huh.
was. And 3 weeks later, like, wait a second, what was that window like? Or whatever. So having a guide like that helped me a lot through the process.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've thought, of course I'm gonna remember that, and then I don't remember.
Yes. Yeah.
With the proof pages, was there anything that you changed as a result of seeing the proof pages?
Yeah. And I should have pulled those out. I didn't pull them out, but especially for the second book, we added a red into the second book, and
Mhm.
it just wasn't a bright enough red.
Mm.
So when I did the first proofs, I was trying to keep it very much in line and kind of
Mhm.
a little muted like the first book's palette, but it really needed to be punchy. So
Mhm.
we did reproof that. Um, yeah, so the second book has a growlometer, the first book has the wagometer, and
Mhm.
so the
Mhm.
growlometer needed red. So there
Mhm.
were things like that where we're like, no, that's not punchy enough. That needs to be more,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. Remember if there were the main thing that happened with the first book was that they proofed it on uncoated and coated paper, and that was the big decision. Uncoated is
Mhm.
obviously a little bit not quite as vibrant. So we ended
Mhm.
up going with the coated paper, which I'm okay with now. I like it, but I really love uncoated paper. So it
Mhm.
was one of those compromise situations where I was like, oh, okay, I think you're right, but you know,
Yeah, I don't know why it is that a lot of people who are designers, I feel like prefer uncoated.
yeah, yeah, I
Something
guess
about
so.
it.
The designer bias.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you mentioned the wagometer and the growlometer, and that sort of leads me into the third key point that you mentioned when we were emailing back and forth, which I'm also excited to talk about, which is research.
Mm.
So you said you had to do a lot of research for this book, especially since you are talking about that domestication of wolves to dogs. So can you say a little bit about what was the research you did and how did it end up being incorporated into the story?
Sure. Yeah. The research started with reading every book about dogs and domestication I could get my hands on. And the really cool thing is that there have been all kinds of advances, maybe in the past 10 years, in terms of just studying dogs and
Mhm.
understanding what's really going on with them. Up until that point, we could guess, but they're now able to put them in fMRI machines and watch their brains and see
Mhm.
how they react to different stimuli. So
Mhm.
now we know now, for example, that when humans and dogs interact, that oxytocin, the love hormone, is
Mhm.
released on both sides. Like it
Mhm.
is a very symbiotic relationship. It's not necessarily just that your dog wants you for food, to give them
Mhm.
food,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
is kind of nice to know, because a
Mhm.
cynical person might think, oh, they're just they just want
Uh-huh.
food or whatever. But that there really is a true connection there. And there's all kinds of interesting research along those lines. So all the fMRI stuff is really fascinating and really gives you a window into
Mhm.
what it's like to be a dog. And then let's see, I think the things for me that were super fascinating were just realizing how much like wolves dogs still are, that they share 99.9% of their DNA, and that so much of what we might think of dogs as kind of their human behavior, like their playfulness, their sweetness, is all reflected in it's wolves. That all comes from wolves. It's all
Mhm,
reflected in
mhm,
what wolves are, and that was interesting to me, and obviously not what we've been told in story fairy tales for however long. So I sort of wanted to represent the wolf as more of a, like I call it curmudgeonly professor than a bad guy. At first it's like,
mhm,
oh, the wolf's just going to be our bad awful villain, but
mhm,
there's obviously conflict with the wolf in the story, but it was important to me that the wolf was not just your typical ferocious wolf, that
mhm,
didn't make sense at all. um the other thing that was really fun is I went to a wolf sanctuary
mm.
and hiked with wolves, spent an evening just hanging out with wolves. I got kissed by a wolf, just like really got in there, did the research. It was hard,
Wow.
but um, so someone, I love talking to kids about it. I'm like, yeah, that's my job. I had to get kissed by a wolf. That's what I had to do for this job. But again, interesting,
Let
amazing.
me stop you there though. I'm actually really surprised. So, I didn't know that wolves are affectionate with humans.
So in general, they're not, but there are a lot of wolf sanctuaries with wolf rescues who are
Oh,
either wolf dogs or wolves who are raised by humans, in which case they are more
okay.
accustomed to being around people and affectionate. And
Mhm,
it's not necessarily affection as much, I think, as kind of exploratory behavior. Like that's how
mhm,
they
mhm,
they figure out but they're very curious, and
mhm,
I mean, it's a curiosity, just trying to, like, who
mhm,
are you, what are you all
mhm,
about? And
mhm,
that was really neat to see. Not all of them, of course,
mhm,
but
mhm. Right.
yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. So when were there aspects of research that ended up in a literal way in your book?
For sure. I mean, one of the things that I knew I wanted to do with the book, again, because I have the magazine background, was to have different, I always call it points of entry, different ways for
Mhm,
people to find their way in. So there is back matter that is very much based on all of the research and the facts
mhm,
and the things that to me were sort of fascinating about wolves and dogs that I thought kids would also you find interesting just in terms of their behavior. I mean, I think I wrote the entire book because I'm always wondering what my dog is thinking. Like that was
mhm,
the
mhm,
starting point, right? We all want to know what our
mhm,
animals are thinking. And then also wanting to understand some of her wildness. She's very wild.
mhm,
Like, our dogs can seem human in one moment and then
mhm,
totally wild in another, and to have a better sense of where that all came from. And so the back matter for me answers those questions a little bit, or at least digs into them. And it comes out of all the research. It's all
mhm,
obviously nonfiction and based on everything I learned.
mhm,
And then there's some little sections between the chapters, these little like interstitial moments. Like this one is called
mhm,
Maintain Contact, and it
mhm,
just shows all the ways that the dog is always
mhm,
next to the human. And that, of course, that's loosely based on what I've learned in terms of their pack behavior and how wolves, I think they touch each other just like to check in 12 or something times an hour. Like that's
mhm,
just, as a pack, they're just always making sure the relationships are strong, that everybody is cool. And
mhm.
that whole, just
Something
the
that we
pack
humans
mentality was
need to do
very
as well.
interesting to me. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
couldn't resist saying Oh, wow, okay. So, I would love to circle back again one more time to the storytelling and story structure, uh, which we touched on already. Did you have any sort of um, physical way that you mapped out the story or manipulated elements in the story as you were still in that early stage of figuring out what the story was?
Yeah, I did do index cards for a while. I
Mm-hmm.
think again that almost kind of the way that I was talking about running it through different prisms. I think I try a lot of different things. Every time I get stuck, I move to something else. So I did index cards for a while. I felt like, okay, I think I have a sense of how this is working. And then I generally rely a lot on an outline now. Then I just kept outlining over and over again until it felt like it was hitting all the points that I wanted it to. So I would, yeah, those are the two main ways that I worked on the story. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we kind of covered everything that I wanted to cover, but most importantly, I want to end with where people can connect with you. And if you could tell us a little bit about what you have coming out soon. And once again, repeat this book came out just like yesterday, or is
Last
that
week. Last week. Yes, it's been
week?
out for
Okay.
about a week. Yeah. Sure. So people can connect with me on KCU because I'm there for sure. My website is aquapup, AQUAPUP.com. And let's see, what am I working on? I'm working on, there are 2 more books in this series. So as I said before, I just finished the second book in the series, which is called A New Dog in the Den, in which Sage brings a foster dog into the house and Thunder has to figure out how to communicate in dog as well as in human. The first book is really about figuring out how to be a dog in a human world, because I don't think it's an easy thing for them. And so the second book expands into figuring out how to be a dog in a human world and communicate with other dogs, because it's a lot of different sort of communication, which I witnessed in our house here. And then we have the third book that I'm working on. And I'm working on a book for Candlewick, which is a little bit older. So that's probably 10 to 13-ish. And it's a book about puberty and ghosts, which I'm super excited to dig into. We're starting to work on. So,
oh, wow. Yeah. And any picture books as well?
Not right now. I have a couple of ideas, little things brewing in the background, but honestly, my head has been very much in this space and very focused on deadlines.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
you do have a lot going on.
Yeah, I know. I have a little list and I keep thinking, oh, I'm going to get back to working on that. And no, it hasn't happened recently.
Okay. And do you have a newsletter?
I do. And there's a sign up on my website for sure. So people should sign up there. And I do it 3 or 4 times a year. It's not super frequent, but it's enough to sort of kind of keep up, I guess, what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So aquapup.com. Oh, where did that name come from?
It came from one of my dogs that loved to swim, like with pure joy and abandon. And I thought that's a good name for a website. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, Bethany, this has been so great. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And I think everybody's going to learn so much from this.
Thank you for having me. It's always great to talk to you. And thank you for KCU always.